Betty and Bryce, which will bring us the knowledge about how we can use this instrument of rural proofing, which is not so much new. There is, for I think over 20 years experience in rural proofing, but the question is how could we use it? And what is interesting, I think, is that we also later on will have another session to bring this rural proofing as an instrument to the local level, because that's also where we hear on this National Rural Parliament. What I see is I'm a Vice President of the European Rural Community Alliance, and that means that I have also to welcome members, for instance, from ERCA from all over Europe, because we have a live stream now, and that's very nice to share the knowledge of Betty Ann to other people that are interested. So welcome to all those viewers at home. On behalf of ERCA, I'm a member of the Rural Pact Coordination Group. The Rural Pact is one of the issues forthcoming from the long-term vision for the rural areas that Europe, the European Commission, produced in 2021. And alongside with this the long-term vision came a lot of instruments. How can we promote the rural areas? And one of these instruments is, in fact, the Rural Pact. It is some kind of a network of all the parties that are important or play a role in support the rural development. And another instrument is rural proofing. And I think I'm very, I want to hear, I would like to hear from Betty Ann whether she thinks also that the fact that in the rural, in the long-term vision, the rural proofing is promoted again, did it really give a boost to rural proofing in Europe? That would be one of my questions. So I'm very happy that Betty Ann is here as a global specialist from the OECD, and I think she had a marvelous story about how we can use rural proofing and perhaps also how we can avoid disappointments with rural proofing. So the floor is yours, Betty Ann.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today. My name is Betty Ann, as was stated earlier, and I'm American, so you don't have to bury the lead there. I've been with the OECD on and off for 11 years, always working in rural, and I spent 8 years working for the department in the United States on rural development issues at all levels of government, including 4 years in the White House. So I come to you from two perspectives. Someone who tried to do rural proofing in the United States, we can talk offline about how well that went, and someone who believes that despite what you are trying to do, this is very relevant to the work. It is ongoing, whether you give it a lot of attention or not. It's a necessary piece of the puzzle to support rural development in rural areas. So this presentation comes from a report that was done with the WHO. They are interested in bringing rural proofing to the wider WHO community of countries. So there goes to that widening interest in applying rural proofing, and you can wonder why it keeps coming up. In order to get to this work, when I returned to the OECD 2.5, 3 years ago, I undertook kind of an interview process with 3 different parts of the rural proofing puzzle. Academics who have written extensively on rural proofing, and if you do a Google search, it's not that many. So I was able to talk to all of them who have passionately loved or hate it. I think it's about equal. Countries who have tried it, so they are forerunners, the countries who started it and implemented it early. I spoke to all the government actors who were involved to understand what worked and what didn't, from Canada to all parts of the United Kingdom and Ireland and Finland. And then countries who were thinking about it, and countries who were thinking about it but decided not to. So I really am sharing with you a perspective that evolved from all of those. So with that in mind, let's really think first what you think it is, right? And so we define things by defining what it's not. It's not a policy, right? It is in many ways a process. If you think about it, it's a process. It's a policy support resource, right? It's meant to support policymakers and the policymaking process, but it's not meant to itself be a policy. The reason I stress that is because then if you don't frame it correctly, you will then be disappointed in the results. So first you understand it's a process. And I always say, think about it as a car coming down a supply chain. When you have a car and you're putting it together and you're manufacturing it, the windows go on, the doors, everyone is doing their part. It has different parts to it. It can enable policymakers, particularly those who are less familiar with rural, to make informed decisions. But it has to be clear, concise, and timely evidence. So the components of a process, it's clear, it's concise, it's given in a timely manner, and there's evidence. And we'll get to what those pieces are, but then when you look at it from that direction, you understand what it's compiled of. It's not meant to be a tick box exercise, but it can become one when the different components in the process are not working well together. So it's a process that has many parts to it. If you want to put it all together, you're gathering evidence. You're involving stakeholders. You're delivering information that's flexible. So it has to apply to it can apply to different levels of government, regional, national, local. It's also flexible in how you put the process together, right? So you are adapting it, you're learning on the go. So you have to take all those pieces on board. So I like to frame it that way because when you try to set yourself up to be disappointed, you have to understand these are the different components that are more or less involved in the rural proofing process. And also, it's going on in countries whether you're calling it rural proofing or not. The act of thinking about a policy and how it could, unfold in different parts of a country are in of itself the proofing part. You're trying to check in advance to see what could be the impacts. We're just focusing more on rural areas. Some of the key lessons that came out of all the discussions, and that are also ongoing lessons, is the reality of it is complex. The visual I just showed you shows you why it's complex in both design and execution, because pulling together a functioning rural proofing process is inherently the first step to then getting it to work. So if the parts are not put together correctly, thinking again about the supply chain and the car, if you put the window where the door is, you can't be surprised if the rural proofing result is maybe not what you're looking for. The positive thing is that, again, there's increased interest, as I just said. Now it's expanding South Africa is doing it. I'm talking to a lot of countries outside the OECD member countries that are trying it. So there's instinctively why the interest is growing, even though you can talk to every country, the results are hit or miss, right? We'll get to how you measure success, but there's something about the fact that it inherently is growing, even though folks maybe have a love-hate relationship, and I'm sure inside your own country, you will find parties who have a love-hate relationship with rural proofing. I think it's just inherently, we always have that uncle that we love and we don't like, It's just going to be that. You just have to accept that that's what it will be and how it will be received. And the challenge for rural proofing, because it has so many parts to it, is how to make it sustainable and introduce it into and embed it into your policy space. So, and when you hear me say embed it into your policy space, there's no one size fits all to rural proofing, even within country. How you rural proof in County X or Province X could be different in how you rule-proof in Province Y or County Y, and that's what makes it complex, is that when you try to make a one-size-fits-all rural proofing style, you inherently are setting yourself up for failure, because it is that flexibility piece. It has to be adapted to the context within the space within which you are working. Rural proofing is less successful when the objectives for rural proofing are unclear and vague. Why are you rural proofing? What is your goal? What is your outcome? Inherently, no matter how well everything else is put together, if it's not clear, how can you measure vague and say it failed? When the supporting instruments are not good or fall short in a few ways, lack information, are not designed for the rule proofer, because there is a rule proofer, right? And some people forget that someone has to rule proof. Relies on weak evidence, what I call rural proofing intelligence, which we'll get to, is cumbersome, bureaucratic, and is not designed for governments who don't think rural. We also have to remember, who are you designing your rural proofing mechanism for? You're not designing it for a person who thinks rural, because inherently maybe that person does not need it. You're designing it maybe for actors who are not in the room, who don't think rural, departments of housing, departments of transportation, et cetera, et cetera. That's who you're designing a rural proofing mechanism for. So sometimes that gets lost in the passion of saying we have to work on rural. Who are you designing it for? And who is the rural proofer? When the rural proofing window is missed, there is a window, right? There's a point where you're rural proofing and you can change the policy, and after that you are evaluating. That's not rural proofing. So where's that rural proofing window? Do you understand the window? Are you working within the window? And are the instruments and is the process designed to fit the window that you are working within, right? So these are all the things that take away from the value and how you set up your rural proofing process. Is it built around a negative narrative of rural? A lot of times we talk about rural as if it's the beggar at the table or the stepchild that you have to feed. Again, it goes back to who are you asking to rural proof? You're asking the housing department to rural proof by remembering rural. Why is rural positioned in a negative position? Why is the narrative of rural negative? If the narrative of rural is negative, then the person you're talking to perceives it as negative. And then it becomes, here we go again, we have to help rural, right? Rural has places of opportunity. Do you believe that? So you position rural as if it's a place of opportunity, as if it is equal at the table, and it has something to offer, and you have to work with me because I am equal to you. But if you position rural to be a place that needs help, that is under the table, underwater, that affects your narrative, because remember, you are not the audience for rural proofing. The audience for rural proofing are actors outside of the rural space who are designing policies that will impact the rural space. So why we don't want to be seen that way? That's very important, the narrative. Communication, and when you set up rural proofing, again, it's vague. There's a narrative out there that says rural proofing failed. And I would say, why did it fail? Oh, because it didn't work. How do you know it didn't work? What about it? So you really have to set up your design and then set up your objectives and understand what rural proofing is supposed to do, right? Before you can say it fails. And that communication is important because that's the perception out there. I was in Ireland. I'm working on my other life. I do rural reviews, and I'm currently leading a rural review of Ireland policy. And I was talking to some government leaders a week ago, and they said, "Banana, rural proofing failed." And I said, "What did you expect it to do? Change the whole country? Change the whole world?" Then you're always going to think it's failed, right? So you have to understand what it's supposed to do before you can say it failed. Again, when you're not using data, it really relies on what I call rural proofing intelligence. And I know you can't wait to see what I mean by that. And this is something that's relevant, so I wanted to make sure you understood it, when it's too dependent on political support. Because politics, I know in my own country, ebbs and flows. So if rural proofing is like in 1 week and out next week, you're setting it up for failure. So you can work with the political support, but if it relies too much on having it, it's going to take away from its value and sustainability. Less agreement on what we mean by rural. I won't touch the Netherlands conversation. I will speak about Ireland here. I just had what had to be extensive interviews with over probably 500 government officials, from parliament members all the way down in Ireland, and no one could agree on what the definition of rural was in Ireland. It's outside Dublin. Everyone agrees. Rural is out there. But once you have that definition of rural, how do you rural proof? So having some sense of what you mean by rural helps you to rural proof, because that's just the reality. You don't have to tell me what it is. You can keep it a secret, but if everyone has a different definition of what they see rural is, it's very hard to then check to see if you're doing what you should be doing for rural if you don't know what rural means. So I'm going to go just through 3 items that I think are really important. The narrative piece is very important because of who you are asking to rural proof. What you're asking. Think about it logically. If you go to the Department of Housing and you want them to take a housing policy and think about the effects on rural, where they don't spend their time thinking about rural, you have to change the narrative and say, remember rural. Yes, it's nice if they do it because they should, but we're in a political space, fast moving, you need more than that. So if you position rural better, to think about always, what benefit does rural bring? Rural brings a lot of benefit. We don't have to bury the lead. We know that it does. You can't achieve climate change goals without working with rural. So all those goals that are out there cannot be done without working with rural areas. Rural areas are on the front lines of a lot of things. Rural areas are areas that organically attract investment. We did a really important study years ago about promoting growth in all places across Europe. We looked at 23 regions and we demonstrated that organically there were rural regions in Europe that were outperforming urban areas. So rural regions have strengths that are undertapped. And if we don't reposition our narrative on rural, it sets us up. Yes, they have challenges. Yes, people are leaving, et cetera, but you can say people are leaving. You can say we have an aging population, or you can say we have a seasoned population with a lot of experience who can bring vitality and new information into rural areas, right? It's how you frame it. I'm a lawyer by training, so I can do this all day. You have to know who your rural proofer is. People talk about rural proofing, and I always say, but who's rural proofing? Who's the rural proofer? Is the rural proofer in the room? Right? You have to design your rural proofing mechanism for the rural proofer, that civil servant. I was a rural proofer. And I can tell you, when I rural proofed at the White House level, and I ran down the hill or ran into a room, you know what my extensive rural proofing background was? How do you see this working in rural? That's it. And it's because a lot of it was in my head, so I could go, stop, what are you thinking? What's going on? If I'm working at the regional level, I have more time. But the rule proofer, who is me, running across DC like a crazy person, how much time do I have to go through seasoned documents and do all the pieces and stuff? So who is a rule proofer? How much time do they have? Has the equipment that you gave me, is it enough to suit how I'm working, right? I did this I shared with colleagues last night that I did this presentation in a different way. In Finland, who is considered to be the leader on rule proofing across the board. And when I said this, there were gentlemen in the room stood up and said, that's the first time anyone has ever talked about it from my perspective. I'm the rule proofer, and I don't have time to do half the things they told me to do. So when you're designing this with your passion, with your engagement, with all the information you want to put in there, you have to step back and say, who is the rule proofer? And is the rule proofer in the room, designing it, co-designing it with me, giving me feedback so that it can actually be embedded into your process and not this, so you're not setting yourself up for disappointment. I did all these pieces, but no one took it on board because, again, there are some pieces missing. So civil servants, they're no different no matter what country you are. They're overburdened, under-resourced, mildly bitter. Now you're giving them extra activities and extra steps to do. This is how it becomes a checklist. When there's too much, they say, I looked at the form and I put it aside. So the rule proofer has to be thought about in this process. And that changes because the real rule proofer at the national level may or may not need different types of tools or support mechanisms than if you're doing it at the regional level and if you're doing it at the local level. So that's how you have to be thinking about it. And that's what makes rule proofing complex, because it sounds simple, but as you're listening to me, I hope you understand why it's these tailoring pieces that makes it a bit more complicated, but in a good way, and that in the end makes it more effective. The sustainability piece I mentioned again is one where you build it so that it's less dependent on political support. Now, don't get me wrong, it needs political support sometimes, especially when it's new or it's, we're not sure where it's going. But at the end of the day, you have to figure out how to embed it, right? So we talk a lot about political commitment on its own does not lead to sustainability. Canada, the Canadian government can explain that to you. They started it, government changed, it went away, then it came back, then it went away, then it came, it doesn't work. So what you need to think about is embedding it into the civil servant mindset. That's it. And that's why the other part about the rule proofer becomes so important. When you build it with the rule proofer, civil servants don't turn over as much as your political level. So when you're designing it with him or her involved, they'll have it in their minds as they move from role to role, and then they share it out. One of the things that I did different when I was with the US government was every time some new policy came along, I would go to staff meetings because I was a civil servant. And I would say, hey, department, can I get into your staff meeting? Can I meet with the folks who are writing your grants? Can I meet with the folks who are drafting your next strategy? Because as a civil servant, they were like, sure. And then I went in and we talked. Did it always work? But we leave a mark. 2 months later, Betty Ann, I heard about you. Could you come over here? So it was about embedding it into the culture. I've left government now, 2.5 years. One of the funnest experiences I get calls now saying, I channeled my inner Betty Ann. I was in a meeting and I said, how do you see this working on rural? That's how you embed it into the mindsets of your civil servants, because they're the ones that are the actual pen to the policies that you are and the change that you're looking for. I like to say develop sophisticated rural intelligence, because that's kind of what's going to support rural proofing, right? Different ways of collecting data. The evidence for the change is what we're talking about. I'd like to say it looks a little bit like this. So it has different parts to it. There's state of the rural data, which is very broad. And then it gets a bit more narrow when you look at potential impact data, and rural added value data. So when I put that together, I call that your rural proof in intelligence, right? Because each of them on their own could do something, but taken together, they form a powerful way to have a discussion and to inform policymakers with a rich body of different types of evidence. Some of this could be qualitative and some of this is quantitative, and that's fine. Just understand that not all of this exists in the sense that it probably does exist, but it has not been compiled or put together in the way that I'm framing it. State of the rural data is just that. Remember again what I said. Who are you trying to convince to do rural, right? Agencies, departments that don't think rural. So state of the rural data is just that. Population migration data, transportation and travel data, all the pieces that are out there already, probably in different departments, that are compiled to be like state of the rural. Scotland does this. There are many different countries are undertaking this endeavor. And when we were in the US, we showed them state of the rural, the US just started doing it. They're like, okay, this makes sense. Just put it on your website. So it's a link. So when someone has no understanding of what you want to tell them, this is a level of economic growth. This is X, this is Y. Some state of the rural data is relevant, and that's broad. Now let's go a bit narrow. And here we get into areas that probably don't exist, but would be helpful. Impact data. That's data when they're trying to take an action, whatever that action is, right? Now you need to go a bit and provide evidence of why that action or what potentially that impact could be on rural. So it's one thing to say you should rural proof. Stop doing what you're doing. It's another thing to say because based on the evidence, it would have this impact, right? So sometimes we need impact data. That's different from state of the rural data because it could overlap, but if the person is trying to do something, you need to understand what is the problem they're trying to solve. Because normally when an idea comes up, it's a problem that's being solved. So someone says, for example, when I was in the UK, in London, they had all dogs should be on a leash. What's the problem they were trying to solve? Because in London, they were built from an urban, but obviously when you're in rural areas, there's a lot of dogs that have to be off leash for different reasons. So technically they were breaking the law, right? And people would say if you were rural proofing, that law would not exist. But first you have to understand what's the problem they're trying to solve, and then you provide evidence of the impact of that policy. Now, this is where it becomes challenging because sometimes that doesn't exist. And that's where people and groups, stakeholders, working groups, you can start early by providing or be working on impact data. Value-added data is even more difficult. That's probably more case studies, probably doesn't exist. But this goes back to the narrative. Now you have to appeal to that side of the politician that is important. What is the problem you're trying to solve? And how working with rural will help you solve that problem, right? That's rural bringing value to that problem. Climate change, rural bringing value to the problem. Not, oh, this is going to have a deficit and deprive rural. But working with rural will help you reach your goals, and it doesn't have to take away from the impact on rural area. And this is relevant evidence when this is more case studies, right? So you understand the problem they're trying to solve, closing some grocery stores, doing whatever they want to do because it comes from somewhere. Even if we love or hate government, policies come from a problem that they see as a problem that they're trying to solve. What is that problem? How is working with rural going to help you get there? That's how you reposition the value added of rural, right? Rural can help solve problems, whether it's an economic problem, whatever the problem is. But we have to reposition rural with evidence. When you put that all together, you are starting to provide some better rural-proofing intelligence. More importantly, you are helping that person who doesn't think rural to understand what they need to think about and to work with rural to solve their problem instead of working against rural. Now, does this happen overnight? No, it does not. It's an incremental effort. You'll have wins, you'll have losses, and not everyone has that data, right? That takes time to put it together, working together at the local level, working with institutions that already existed, compiling it, packaging it. And so I like to say about rural proofing, set your expectations and failure is not a problem because you're not going to get rural proofing right the first time. And expecting to get it right the first time is then setting yourself up for disappointment. Because everything I just said takes time, and you learn through trial and error, right? So you bring some bureaucrats into the room. No, this won't work. You didn't fail. Try again. You build it in for feedback loops to go, oh, we're testing. So in the paper, I talk about build it like a pilot, as pilot testing, where every failure is information to make the next iteration better, right? And that way you are setting yourself up for success. How do you measure rural proofing? You have to set, again, those realistic expectations. One of the things I heard, even internally, is this wasn't rural proof. Rural proof failed. Rural proofing cannot force a politician to act. Even when that's an unfair expectation. When does rural proofing really fail? Do you understand when it fails? It doesn't fail because a politician didn't act, because it's not a policy. You can't force someone to take an action. It fails if it's not enough information, if the information is not clear, all of the pieces aren't there. But if everything, you've packaged it very well, everything is there, you caught the politician right on time, and he still did it anyway. That's not rural proofing failure. It's an unfair expectation of rural proofing. And that's what happens when people say, don't rural proof because rural proofing failed. Decisions are taken in politicians for different reasons that are outside the scope. Expecting just because you've packaged it well that it will then lead to this big change right away is too much. However, incremental wins, where every time you work with someone, you're embedding it into the culture, and over time, you'll see the change because it starts to seep in, is what you should focus on. Building out that piece. So every time it's not always going to go your way. So we always encourage that communication angle. There's always even a justification for why this time around it makes sense to go left instead of right. And I think that communication piece of communicating good and bad news is important, and building those feedback loops is important. So I've had plenty, and I won't go too much into that, but that's a really important part of rural proofing mindset, is that we are working on long-term change over time, so we have to kind of think about how to embed it. Martin wanted to make sure I gave you some examples of just another elements that we're talking.
Could you speed up a little bit?
Sure.
Of course, there are questions. So.
Yes. And so really quickly, actually, I'm at the end. It was just 4 examples from countries of taking pieces, different examples of that, and how they decided to build in their rural proofing work. So I'll leave that for you to read. But for example, Estonia is focused on kind of embedding it into their policymakers, right? Embedding it into the culture. The Chilean government is trying to do the same. They're trying to build it from day one into a system where they built a working party to bring all civil actors together to test different versions of tools that could be supportive to them. United States built a network that was where they kind of put rural actors inside different parts of agencies to help with rural proofing. So there are, again, different ways that it can be done. I'll leave the slides for you to take a look at them. I will point out that, for example, in Finland, they were very clear that they have a different rural proofing method that they use at the national, regional, and local level. So it goes again to that flexibility of how you build your mechanism. And these are all, I didn't talk about all of them, but in the paper I talk a lot about all the things that you can think about to increase the effectiveness of rural proofing. And these are all, some of them I spoke about, some of them I didn't. So that was essentially the end.
Thanks so much. I think what you brought us is really a story of hope, rural hope, I think, and also we should look at it in a realistic way. It's complicated, complex, but it can be done. I have a lot of questions, but of course our audience perhaps also have questions. Please go ahead. You can take oh wow, sorry. You can take the mic in front of you. Just push the button. If you want to put your question in Dutch, we try to translate. But please, it's up to you, Henk.
Thank you, Betty, and really an interesting and, for me, clarifying presentation around the notion of rural proofing. I have one question. In the Netherlands, we don't have a long tradition of rural proofing, not a tradition at all. And you did so many comparative analysis around rural proofing throughout the world. How would you explain that the Netherlands does not have any explicit rural proofing tradition? What would be the key factors in relation to that? Is it because the notion rural is too much contested, perhaps, in itself, so let's just skip the rural proofing exercises? What could you say about that?
I think a lot of that has to do with, sometimes there is some version of rural proofing, because remember, rural proofing is just, at the end of the day, you're going for balanced development. No government is going for imbalanced development, right? So when you don't have a clear definition of what you think rural is, it's much harder, especially in a very urban, focused country like the Netherlands. It's harder to rural proof when you don't know what rural is. That's why I started with that. It's because they may think they're regional proofing, right? Because people think regional proofing, but rural proofing is different from regional proofing. And so it starts there. First, you're thinking like they're looking at balanced development, but potentially balanced development between the bigger cities and kind of the smaller cities. And if you're not looking at rural and what rural is and how rural is shaped, then it's hard to then say rural proof for it. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, perhaps we have kinds of rural proofing, but we don't call it that way. And okay, other questions? Yes.
Yes, so my question is, you've had various experiences in regards to also different levels where you've talked with policymakers in the context of rural proofing. What would be your, how do you say that? Where could we make the biggest effort to invest in more rural proofing here in the Netherlands? Like, would it be on a national level or would it be on more regional levels? Because, well, we have a very large discussion in the Netherlands now because of a recent report where it says that every region counts. So where would you say that it would be best to invest time also for policymakers to invest their time for implement rural proofing?
I'm going to put the question back on you in a different way. What's having the biggest impact on rural? Where is the biggest impact coming from? Because that is going to, I mean, you could focus at the local level, but if that's not, where's rural feeling this imbalance, so to speak? And then you're responding to that. That's one. Two, you can certainly be doing it at the local level, but you should always be doing it at each level of governance, by the way. But if there's a sense of urgency or a need, it comes back to where do you see the biggest imbalance? And the second part of that is, are you trying to do a whole of government rule proofing, or do you target sectors or take advantage of opportunities? So in the paper, there are countries that cannot take on a whole of government rule proofing because that might be too much, but you can take advantage of opportunities, whether it's a disaster, whether it's uprising, unrest, whether it's something that brings more focus to an issue, to then start there as a way to then domino out. And that's what some bigger countries are doing. And countries that are new to rule proofing are not trying to grab everything. They might do health, they might try education, they may try disaster relief in some countries. So again, it's how you, again, your context.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, Wendy.
We're from a university, and of course, listening to your story, I also hear a lot of added value through universities as knowledge partners. Could you enlarge a bit about how you work together in rural proofing with those knowledge partners?
Sure. I think, again, at every stage, which is, if you go back to the slide I had earlier about gathering evidence and then engaging and involving stakeholders, I think citizens, expert advisors have a role in all parts of that. When you're building those quantitative evidence, you need partners who already have access to that, who can easily digest that. So we talk a lot about leveraging what you already have before you go out looking for new. And if you already have relationships, and governments tend to do this already with educational institutions, you can leverage already those. At the same time, for working groups, for gathering information, for helping to organize the information, bringing them in. Now, what I will say is that sometimes, and here this is where it changes at different levels, when a government actor, when I needed information really quickly, we had relationships where I could call a school and say, hey, X is trying to do Y, M, and Z. I think this is going to be a problem. Give me 4 bullet points. So we call it like the red phone. So you can organize, and again, this changes when you're at the regional level. You have more time to bring in more. And then at the local level, it's a bigger steering committee. But then this is where those relationships become more manageable, or should be kind of thought about along the lines of the timing of how quickly information has to be come in and out.
Thanks. A last question, looking at the clock. Here, a last question, also not. Well, then I think we should come to an end. So thanks so much, Betty. And I think what you brought us is a realistic story about what rural proofing can mean, and especially what it can mean for, let's say, making rural more special, and looking at how we can put up rural on the agendas and use it as a real, as some kind of an emancipation instrument for rural. And I think that is also necessary in the Netherlands, because what we lack of is some kind of a holistic vision on what rural is. When I make the resemblance with the long-term vision for rural areas on European level, we don't have such a holistic vision, and that would be a start. And then I think, with all the complexities you elaborated on, we could use this instrument, or this broad toolbox about rural proofing, to really bring rural areas higher on the agenda, and also to make the life in the rural areas more livable as it is. And I think what I also like very much, that you made this point of rural is not the child that you have to feed constantly. There's so much positive, and that is the story, the narrative we should bring on. Thanks very much. You will be with us later on also for a little while, but now thanks very much. And of course, there's a big applause for you now.